The attic smelled of old pine and coal dust. It was January 1957 in Vermont, and the wind rattled the narrow windows like a restless spirit. Henry Mallory, 12 years old and endlessly curious, had crept into his grandfather's attic during one of those silent afternoons when Thomas Mallory fell into his chair by the fireplace and stared into it like it still burned with memories. Henry wasn't supposed to be up there. The attic was where silence lived, thick and untouched, but something called to him, maybe the hidden stories in the walls, or maybe it was the way his grandfather always hesitated before looking at the ceiling. Either way, the moment he pushed open the creaking door, a sliver of icy air kissed his face, and he stepped into the forgotten. Dust swirled in thin beams of light. Boxes lined the sides like tombstones, marked in faded handwriting. Sarah, 1938. Thomas, Army, Misk. One box in the far corner had no label. Just a single iron clasp rusted shut, the wood darkened as if burned. It looked older than the rest. Henry's breath turned white as he knelt beside it. The clasp gave with a weak snap. Inside were yellowed papers, a pocket watch, a broken pipe, and one envelope. It was thick, sealed with dark red wax, and despite the cold air and its ancient companions, the ink on the front was still damp to the touch. Henry blinked. That wasn't possible. The writing said, "To my dearest Liesel, Vienna, winter of 1917. It wasn't his grandfather's handwriting. The attic moaned as the wind pressed harder outside. Henry looked over his shoulder, heart thudding. He knew he should leave it, close the box, walk downstairs, pretend none of this ever happened. But he didn't. He turned the envelope over. The wax was pressed with a symbol, a fleur-de-lis encircled by what looked like two wings. Strange, familiar somehow. He gently opened the seal, careful not to tear the parchment. The moment the letter slipped free, the attic felt colder. The writing inside was beautiful, looping, hurried yet precise, like someone had written it in great haste, but with care. The first lines read, "If you are reading this, then I have failed to return. I write from the frozen mouth of the Carpathians, where the blood snow will not melt, and silence is louder than bullets." Henry read the words aloud in a whisper, barely understanding. What was this? Who was Liesel? And who wrote this? Before he could read further, a heavy creak snapped his attention. Footsteps, someone was coming up the stairs. He folded the letter quickly and placed it inside his coat. The envelope followed. He closed the box and backed away, silently as he could, his heartbeat now a thrum in his ears. The attic door opened. "Henry?" his grandfather's voice called, low and distant. I was just looking," Henry said quickly, stepping out with innocent eyes. Thomas Mallory stared at him for a long second, his eyes drifting past the boy toward something deeper, darker inside the attic. Then his gaze returned, and he simply nodded. "Don't stay in the cold too long." As he turned away, Henry saw his grandfather's hand tremble slightly on the stair rail. He went down, the letter still tucked inside his coat. It was still slightly wet. Impossible, but true. He didn't know then that opening it had changed everything, that someone had waited decades for it to be read, that the war wasn't over. Not really. Before we uncover the chilling secret of this letter, don't forget to subscribe for more untold historical mysteries. What Henry found wasn't just ink on paper, it was the beginning of a buried truth, frozen in time, waiting to be heard. The letter stayed beneath Henry's mattress for 2 nights before he dared to read it again. He waited until his grandfather fell asleep by the fire, his soft snores echoing in the quiet house. Upstairs, with only the dim light of a lamp and the wind pushing at the windows, Henry unfolded the parchment and began to read it in full. "My dearest Liesel," it began again. "I write from a place where I cannot speak aloud. Each word must be chosen like footsteps in snow that may collapse beneath me. If this letter finds you, I beg you, read it alone and burn it after." Henry swallowed hard. The words felt like secrets whispered from another century. There was weight in them, as if each sentence was pressing through time just to reach his hands. "The men here speak in code. Not all wear the uniform they claim. Even the trees seem to listen, their branches heavy with ice and eyes. I no longer know whom to trust, except you." The writer mentioned a town, Kolomia, and a mountain pass where crows outnumber soldiers. He wrote of a man named Archer, someone who smiled too easily. He warned Liesel never to mention the name Archer to anyone, not even in music. Then came the most chilling line. "There will be blood snow, and when it falls, You must not sing. What did that mean? Henry continued. The final paragraph ended abruptly, the last words trailing off as if interrupted. I have hidden what they seek. The fleur-de-lis holds the path. Remember Vienna. Remember the song I... That was it. No signature, no name. Henry checked the back. Nothing. Then in a small fold near the edge of the page, something caught the light. He turned it, squinting. There, barely visible, was a pressed symbol in wax that had soaked faintly through the paper. The fleur-de-lis again, but beneath it 2 initials carved into the edge of the design. J.A. He whispered it. J.A. Whoever wrote this letter wasn't just a soldier. He had deliberately erased his identity, hiding only those 2 letters like a buried spark. Henry's mind raced. The letter was from 1917, during the war. The wax seal hadn't dried. How could that be? Ink didn't stay wet for 40 years. It defied explanation. He pulled out the envelope again, inspecting every corner. Inside was a second, smaller slip of paper. Folded once, it read, Deliver if I fall, burn if I return, speak of it never. The handwriting matched. Henry knew now the letter was never meant to be read by anyone else. Someone had carried it, hidden it, waited for a moment that never came, and instead of being delivered or destroyed, it had remained buried in a forgotten box, sealed in time. Outside, the wind howled louder. Henry looked at the attic ceiling, wondering how many other secrets lay above. He held the letter close and stared at the initials again. J.A. Could this be someone from his own family? He remembered stories his grandfather told in fragments, of a soldier friend who never returned, of a woman who played piano in Austria, always told in half-thoughts, as if they hurt too much to finish. Henry folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside the envelope, and returned it to its hiding place under his mattress. He didn't know what he had stepped into, but it was more than a war letter. It was a thread in a story not yet told, soaked in fear, love, and something unspoken. He didn't realize yet that finding out who J.A. was would mean uncovering what someone had tried to bury forever. James Ashford had never seen snow until his 19th year. Boston, with its winters, had offered slush and soot, but not this. This velvet silence of white that blanketed everything and made the world seem softer, even when it was breaking. In the winter of 1910, he stood outside Symphony Hall, coat buttoned to the throat, breath curling like smoke, and listened to a sound that would change him. She was playing Liszt. Inside, behind heavy velvet curtains and chandeliers, a young Austrian pianist named Liesl Hartmann was performing her American debut. James, with a ticket he'd borrowed from his father's desk, slipped into the back row and stood against the wall unnoticed. He never forgot that first note. It wasn't just music. It was memory, desire, grief, all sewn into sound. She was only 17, but the way she moved over the keys, it made something inside him ache. That night, James walked home with frozen feet and a heart full of noise. He wrote her a letter, then another. She never answered. It wasn't until spring, months later, that he saw her again, standing in the Boston public garden, sketching the trees. She looked up and caught his gaze. Then, incredibly, she smiled. "Are you the boy who sends too many letters?" she asked in accented English. He stammered a yes. She laughed and offered him a seat beside her. That was how it began. Over the next 2 years, they met in quiet places, libraries, museums, the orchestras backstage. She played, he listened. She spoke of Vienna, of war rumors, of a Europe growing tense. He spoke of his studies in literature, his father's factory, his discontent. Their love was not loud. It was in the silence after she stopped playing, in the way he knew when to turn a page for her, in the letters they continued to write, even when they saw each other daily. But the world was tightening. In 1914, war erupted. Austria called for soldiers. Liesel's family, fearing for her safety, returned home. "I will write," she said at the train station, her fingers trembling in his. "I will send music." He kissed her once, brief and breathless, and watched the train vanish into smoke. The letters came, always with sheet music, sometimes with notes written in the margins. "This melody is how I miss you. This one is for courage." They were like coded messages, full of longing and fear. James read them by candlelight, each note a thread back to her. When America remained distant from the war, he tried to be content. But the papers brought headlines of battles, cities falling, bodies nameless. In 1916, he stopped reading and enlisted. His father called him a fool. His mother wept silently. But James felt called, not by duty or patriotism, but by her. He could not stay while she lived beneath falling skies. He told no one his true reason. In his final letter before departure, he wrote to Liesl, "If the world insists on fire, I will walk through it to find you." He sailed with trembling hands, the memory of her piano guiding him through storms. What he did not know, what he could not have imagined, was that war would not bring him closer to her. It would tear them both from the lives they knew, leaving only letters and silence behind. But even as the ship approached the coasts of Europe, James clutched her last letter in his coat, folded beside his orders. It smelled faintly of lilacs and ink. Her words were written in the margins of a nocturne. "Play this when you return. I will be listening." He didn't know if he would ever hear her play again, but he believed he would. He had to. The sea stretched wide and unforgiving, grey beneath a leaden sky. James stood at the edge of the deck, his knuckles white on the railing, the salt wind cutting through his wool coat. It was February 1917. The ship groaned as it carved a path through waters teeming with unseen dangers, German U-boats, storms, and the unknown future waiting on the other side. There were no speeches, no songs, just the shuddering pulse of the Atlantic and the silence of men pretending they weren't afraid. He kept Liesl's last letter in his chest pocket, folded beside the sheet music she had mailed just before he departed. The piece was titled "Winter Without End." He had read the title again and again, not sure whether it was a warning or a promise. He'd volunteered through a program allowing Americans to join British and French forces. Paperwork was loose, and his accent was a curiosity among European soldiers, not a barrier. Most assumed he was Canadian. James never corrected them. He bunked beside men from Wales, Belgium, and one grim German deserter who spoke only in whispers. The soldiers passed the time playing cards, carving initials into crates or staring at nothing. James wrote letters to Liesl, never knowing if they'd reach her. "My Liesl, each wave between us is a lie I long to undo," he wrote. "But I am coming. I don't care if the world burns beneath my feet." The captain warned them of ice ahead. Another told them not to light cigarettes at night. Light attracted death. They laughed less after that. 2 weeks in, a storm struck. Waves taller than buildings swallowed the sky. James clutched his cot as the world rolled and howled. One man was thrown overboard. They never found his body. When the sea calmed, James walked the deck with soaked boots and hollow eyes. He looked to the east, toward Europe, wondering if Liesl still played, if her hands were warm, if she still believed in the future they once imagined. They reached Bordeaux under moonlight. James stepped off the ship with trembling legs, the ground strange beneath his boots. France smelled like smoke and soil. Trains packed with soldiers carried them northward, toward the front. The journey was long and bitter. Through shattered towns and frozen fields, he saw war's fingerprints, ruined chapels, craters where homes once stood, fences tangled in human bones. He tried not to look too long. In a trench-side camp, a French officer handed out assignments. James was sent east toward the Carpathian front, where the fighting was bloodiest and the cold never broke. "You speak no French, no German," the officer said, half smiling. "You'll be invisible." He was given a uniform that didn't fit, boots that leaked, and a rifle that had seen better wars. As they waited for transport, James played Liesl's music in his mind. Every rest and rise of the melody was a heartbeat. He hummed it softly as snow fell, remembering her voice, low laughing the way she'd lean into him and whisper translations of German poems. In the barracks, another soldier named Tommaso, an Italian violinist turned medic, noticed the humming. "You play?" he asked. James nodded. "Piano, I used to." "You should never stop," Tommaso said. "The war will try to make you forget who you were." That night James opened his satchel and pulled out Liesl's score. He showed it to Tommaso, who studied the notes and raised an eyebrow. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is not just music. It's a letter." James blinked. "What do you mean?" "There are patterns hidden in the rhythm. A message. Perhaps a name, perhaps a warning." James stared at the notes. He hadn't noticed. His heart pounded. Liesl had sent him music, but maybe she had sent him more. The Carpathians were a graveyard of frost and silence. James arrived in early March, the sky a leaden sheet, the snow layered thick over blood-soaked earth. The trenches snaked like veins through the mountainside, filled with men who barely looked like men anymore. Eyes sunken, hands raw, voices ground down to whispers. The air stank of rot and rust. Days were measured by shelling, nights by screams. And through it all, James clutched Liesel's last score like a talisman, hidden in the folds of his coat. He didn't let it out of his sight. His unit was small, 12 soldiers from scattered places. No one spoke unless necessary. There was Andrei, a Romanian scout with eyes too alert, and Weber, a stoic German defector who said little and smoked often. They all moved like ghosts through the frozen trenches, the war etched into their bones. James had never fired a weapon before. On the second night he did. A shadow moved in the mist, and reflex took over. His rifle cracked and a man fell. When they reached the body, it was a boy, barely 15. The silence afterward was worse than the shot. He vomited behind the barracks and didn't sleep for 3 days. Tommaso found him the morning after, sitting alone, turning Liesel's music over in his hands. "You'll go mad if you don't find something to hold on to," Tommaso said. "I already had something," James replied. "Then I came here." The medic sat beside him. "That's why you came, to keep hold of it." James said nothing. The melody of Winter Without End played in his mind again, slow and aching. He began to notice things he hadn't before. Repeated intervals in the left hand, subtle shifts in tempo marked with barely visible dashes. It wasn't random. Liesel had placed them intentionally. Could it be coordinates? A cipher? He didn't know, but it gave him something to think about, something that wasn't death. Each letter he tried to write her ended the same way. A blank page, a trembling hand. In April, the snows began to melt. What they revealed was worse than the frost. Bodies unearthed by the thaw, the scent of decay riding the wind. James kept his scarf soaked in mint oil just to breathe. Rumors spread of a traitor among the ranks, someone sending information to the enemy. Their unit was moved deeper into the mountains, where patrols were suicide missions. James stopped writing altogether. He started sketching the melody instead, trying to piece together whatever Liesel had meant. On one silent night, huddled beneath a tarp with Tommaso and 2 others, Weber spoke for the first time in days. "They say the blood snow never melts," he muttered. James looked up. "What do you mean?" Weber stared into the darkness. "When too many die in one place, the snow remembers. It freezes over them, but the blood stains the earth beneath. It never leaves." James said nothing, but his mind snapped to the line in his letter. "The blood snow will not melt." That was no metaphor. The next morning, a shell hit the trench beside them. 4 men died instantly. James was thrown back, his ears ringing, vision red. When he came to, his coat was gone. So was the music. He searched through the wreckage for hours, frantic, hands bleeding. Tommaso found him sobbing beside a collapsed wall of frozen mud. "It's gone," James said. "She's gone." Tommaso crouched beside him, handed him a folded piece of paper. "I found this near your bunk," he said. "You'll need it more than I will." It wasn't the music, but it was one of her letters, a real one, a message, written by Liesel, unread. James stared at it, hands trembling. Hope flickered again, faint but alive. The letter from Liesel was brief, just 3 lines, hurriedly written in ink that had smudged with time and damp. "They know about the music. Do not trust Archer. He wears your flag, but his heart serves the Reich. The melody is your map. Follow it east." James read it again and again, barely breathing. Archer. The name chilled him. He had heard it only once in whispers, an American liaison officer embedded with high command. Rumor said he was charming, persuasive, and always seemed to know things no one told him. James had never seen his face, but now he had a name and a warning. He kept the letter hidden, tucked inside his boot, and spoke of it to no one, not even Tommaso. Something had shifted in the camp. Eyes lingered too long. Orders came without signatures. Patrol routes changed without notice. One morning, James noticed a map missing from the command post. Later that same day, 2 men from his unit vanished during a reconnaissance. They were never found. That night, James awoke to find a figure standing over his cot. "You talk in your sleep," the voice said. It was Weber. James sat up, heart pounding. "What did I say?" Weber didn't answer. Instead, he held something out. A sheet of folded parchment, muddy and torn. "Found this near the fire pit," he said. "You're lucky I did." It was part of Liesel's music. Pages from Winter Without End. James took it, his fingers trembling. Why are you helping me? Weber's eyes were flat. Because I know what it means to carry something they want to erase. He turned and walked away. James couldn't sleep after that. He stayed awake, tracing the notes with his finger, trying to decode the hidden path. East. She had said east. But there were dozens of mountain passes, hundreds of dead trails. The next day, an American officer arrived at the camp. Polished boots, clean uniform, confident smile. Captain Archer, he introduced himself. James froze. The officer made his rounds, shaking hands, cracking jokes. He asked questions that seemed harmless. Who had served where? Who knew what languages? Who had seen activity near the ridge? When he reached James, his smile didn't waver. Boston accent, he said. That's rare out here. James nodded, forcing calm. Volunteer. Brave of you, Archer said. We could use more men like that. He moved on. That night, Tommaso didn't return from medical duty. James waited, then searched. He found Tommaso's satchel behind the latrine, cut open, its contents scattered. The music pages were gone. The next morning, Archer announced a reassignment. James would accompany him and 2 others on a scouting mission into the Eastern Pass. James knew he said nothing. He packed the bare minimum, including the last letter and the small torn portion of the music Weber had saved. He tucked it inside a hidden seam in his coat, just above his heart. As they marched east into the forest, snow fell in flurries, covering their tracks. Archer led with confidence, too much confidence. James watched his every move. They stopped near a frozen creek. Archer drew a cigarette from a silver case and offered one. James declined. Tell me, Archer said, eyes sharp beneath his smile. Do you play the piano? James didn't answer. I've heard things, Archer continued, about a girl in Vienna, about a tune that makes men disappear. James kept silent. Archer stepped closer. You should be careful who you trust, Private, especially when carrying something that doesn't belong to you. James's hand gripped the edge of his coat. Every muscle screamed to act, but he stayed still. Not yet. He needed proof. He needed a way out. He needed the truth. The forest thickened as they moved deeper into the pass. Snow fell steadily now, blanketing branches and softening the sound of footsteps. Archer led the way, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder, too calm for someone on enemy terrain. James watched every move, noting how the officer never checked a map, never hesitated at forks in the trail. They stopped near a rocky outcrop. Archer motioned for the others to set up camp. James helped gather wood, his thoughts racing. He needed a plan, something he could act on without raising suspicion. Later that night, as the fire crackled low and the men drifted into sleep, James reached into his coat and pulled out the folded page from Liesel's music. He held it close to the firelight and studied it again. There, hidden in the bar lines, small dots, irregular at first glance but spaced with intent. Morse code. He deciphered it slowly, line by line. He is the reason my brother is dead. James's stomach turned. Liesel had lost someone important, and she blamed Archer, or someone working with him. It wasn't just about betrayal, it was personal. The next day they continued east. Archer kept the pace high, barely allowing time for rest. By dusk they reached a narrow ridge overlooking a frozen valley. Beyond that line, Archer said, pointing east, is enemy-controlled territory. James glanced at the others. One looked pale. The other wouldn't meet his eyes. Orders are simple, Archer continued. We monitor, we record, we return. But James saw the trap before it was sprung. The moment they made camp, Archer handed James a folded paper. You'll deliver this to command when we return, he said. No one else. James took it. The seal was fresh, wax red, and stamped with the same insignia from the mysterious letter he'd found in the attic, the fleur-de-lis. His pulse spiked. Later that evening, while the others were distracted, he broke the seal. The letter inside was brief, coded, but James had read enough war communiques by then to recognize what it truly was. A location, coordinates, but they weren't enemy positions. They were Allied supply routes. James stared at the paper, bile rising in his throat. It was confirmation. Archer wasn't just a spy. He was feeding information that would get their own men killed. And somehow Liesel had known. But the letter had been meant for someone else. James wasn't supposed to see it. He refolded it carefully, resealed it as best he could, and slipped it back into his pocket. That night, a snowstorm rolled in. Visibility dropped to nothing. Archer announced they'd wait till morning. James pretended to sleep. Then he heard voices, muffled but close. Archer speaking to one of the other men. "He's seen too much," the officer said. "We don't take him back." James froze. They were going to kill him. He slipped away from the fire and into the woods, heart pounding, legs numb from cold. He ran until the camp was just a faint glow through the trees, then found shelter beneath a fallen pine. He wrapped himself in his coat and read Liesel's letter again by the weak light of dawn. "I sent this with a nurse, Margaret. If it reaches you, she has kept her promise. If it doesn't, I still love you. I will always love you." A nurse. A stranger who had risked everything to get that letter out. But if Liesel had trusted her, then James would too. He tucked the letter close, along with the coded coordinates from Archer's false report. He had to find someone who would listen, someone beyond the chain Archer controlled. His only chance was escape, and time was running out. James never spoke of what happened in the Carpathians. He returned to France weeks later, gaunt, frostbitten, barely able to walk. He claimed he'd been separated during a blizzard. No one asked more. The war didn't have time for details. He carried two things in his coat: the letter from Liesel and Archer's false coordinates. He gave both to a British intelligence officer stationed in Reims. The man read them without expression, asked no questions, and took them without promise. James never saw him again. After that, he was reassigned to supply detail, safer work behind the lines, counting crates and shoveling mud. It suited him. He didn't want to shoot again. He didn't want to remember. The war ended in 1918. He didn't feel joy when it did, just a hollow kind of relief, like a long breath finally exhaled. He returned to Boston in the spring of 1919. His parents met him at the station. His mother cried. His father clapped him on the back and said nothing. They never mentioned the scar across his left shoulder, or the limp, or the way he never looked anyone in the eye. For weeks he stayed indoors, unable to sleep through the night. He dreamed of blood snow, of trees whispering in a language only the dead understood, of Liesel, silent behind a window he could never reach. He wrote to Vienna. No answer. He wrote again. Still nothing. Months passed. He inquired at the Austrian consulate. Records were incomplete. Wartime confusion, they said. Many names lost, many more never listed. Liesel Hartmann had vanished. James kept her letters in a box beneath his bed. He read them only when the world became too loud. Her handwriting soothed him, even when the words couldn't. He tried to find the nurse, Margaret, but all he had was a first name and a fading memory. No one by that name matched the description. Eventually, the letters stopped smelling like her. In 1921, he married Eleanor Perry, a quiet schoolteacher from Montpellier. She didn't ask about the war. He never volunteered. They moved to Vermont, where the winters were long and white, and the snow sometimes howled through the pines just like it had in the Carpathians. He taught literature, planted a garden, pretended peace was something he understood. They had a son, Thomas, who grew into a curious boy with his mother's patience and his father's silence. James loved him fiercely but never told him why. In the attic, James kept the box locked. Inside were Liesel's letters, one page of music, and the fleur-de-lis seal. Eleanor died in 1956, quietly, in her sleep. After the funeral, James moved slower. He took to long walks alone. He stopped speaking as often. Even Thomas, now grown with a son of his own, couldn't reach him. One winter evening, Thomas found James sitting by the fire, eyes closed, a folded piece of paper in his hand. It was one of Liesel's letters. The ink had faded, but James's fingers traced each line like braille. "You never told us about her," Thomas said softly. James opened his eyes. They looked older than his years. "There are some songs," he whispered, "that aren't meant to be played twice." He said nothing more. In the weeks that followed, James wrote in silence, page after page. Some he burned, some he hid. Others he folded into new envelopes and tucked away in old books. He died on a morning when the snow came early. Peaceful, eyes closed, her name on his lips. Thomas found the locked box months later. He didn't open it. Not yet. Henry couldn't sleep. Not since the letter. Since the attic. Since the ink that should have dried 4 decades ago clung to the parchment like it had just been spilled. He read it every night, every morning. In school, he copied it into the margins of his notebooks, hoping repetition would unlock its secrets. He drew the fleur-de-lis over and over again, trying to understand its meaning. Every time his teacher called on him, he flinched, as if pulled back from another century. He hadn't told anyone, not his father, not even his best friend, Max. It felt too big, too sacred, but it gnawed at him. One afternoon, Henry biked to the town library, letter folded tightly in his pocket. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he needed answers. He asked the librarian, Mrs. Keegan, if they had any old war records. She led him to the basement archive. He stayed there for hours. He found nothing on Liesl, nothing on James Ashford, but he kept searching. 2 days later, Mrs. Keegan mentioned a name. "Try Herr Bauer," she said. "He used to teach at the university. Languages, codes, all that. He speaks German fluently." Henry wrote the name down like it was gold. The next Saturday, he knocked on the door of a modest house at the edge of town. A tall man in his 60s opened it. Spectacles crooked, hair wild, eyes sharp despite his age. "You're not selling anything, are you?" Bauer asked. Henry held out the letter. "No," he said, "I need help." Bauer scanned the first lines, then again. He looked up slowly. "Where did you get this?" "In my attic," Henry replied. "It's my great-grandfather, I think." Bauer's brow furrowed. He stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled of pipe tobacco and books. Stacks of papers lined every wall. Bauer moved like a man who lived more in memory than in present time. He read the letter aloud, translating softly as he went. Then he stopped. "He who buried the snow buried her voice," he murmured. "That line, that's not poetry. That's code." Henry leaned forward. "Code?" Bauer nodded, pulling out a pad and pencil. In intelligence work, phrases like these were signals, hidden meanings. Blood, snow, voice, even references to music. They could mean operations, people, or locations. "So it's real?" Henry asked. "Not just, I don't know, a love letter?" Bauer gave him a long look. "Love often carries truth more dangerously than orders do." He pointed to the signature. "J.A., those initials, any idea who that is?" Henry hesitated. "I think his name was James. James Ashford. He fought in Europe." Bauer didn't react, but Henry saw something shift behind his eyes. "I'll help you," the old man said. "But this won't be easy, and it may take time." Henry nodded. "I don't care." They spent the next weeks poring over the letter, line by line. Bauer pulled out maps, dictionaries, war records. He taught Henry how to look for patterns, how to listen to what was unsaid. And slowly, a trail began to form. Vienna, music, betrayal, snow, and always silence. Bauer circled one passage in the letter again and again. "When the notes fall in the fifth, the dead will speak." "Musical code," he muttered. "This is composition language. The fifth note, the fifth measure, it could mean position, time, even people." Henry's head spun, but he kept going. Every clue pulled him deeper. He felt closer to James with every hour, and to Liesl. Who was she? What had she endured? And what had she known that was so dangerous it had to be buried in music? Henry didn't have the answers, but he was going to find them. Even if it meant digging through silence, snow, and decades of forgotten truth. It happened by accident. Henry had returned to the attic one cold November morning, following a hunch. Something about the way the box had been placed, the uneven floorboards beneath it, the faint draft along the wall. It felt unfinished, like a sentence cut short. He pulled everything out, the pipe, the watch, the folded uniforms. Then he tapped along the floorboards, until one gave a hollow knock. It lifted with a creak. Beneath, wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with brittle twine, was a second bundle, smaller, thicker. He untied it carefully. Inside were 10 letters, all addressed to James, all from Liesl. His breath caught, his hands trembled. The envelopes were unopened, unread. The first was dated May 1917. "James, they are watching me. My father says nothing, but I see it in his eyes. I keep your photograph beneath my pillow. It is all I have left." The next letter came weeks later. "I sent music again. I hope it reached you. There is a man who visits our home, an officer. He speaks kindly, but I do not trust his eyes." Then another. "Something has happened. My brother is gone. They say he joined the resistance, but I know the truth. He trusted someone. Someone who smiled with American teeth." Henry read each one in stunned silence, the room spinning slowly around him. Letter after letter, Liesl's words became sharper. Her handwriting changed, from sweeping curves to tighter, jagged strokes. "I cannot leave. They will not let me. My music is no longer mine. They use it for parades, for lies. I have written something new. It is hidden in the old piano. Play the left hand in silence, the rest will follow. And then, they've taken my voice. I don't mean my throat, I mean my soul. Every day they ask me to play, and every day I die a little more. James, if you live, remember who I was. The last letter was dated February 1918. They are coming tonight. I heard them say my name. I don't think I will have another chance to write. I hope Margaret can get this to you. She is brave. Braver than I. If I never see you again, I need you to know. You were the only truth I ever touched. It ended with a smear of ink where her name should have been. Henry sat on the attic floor, the letters spread around him like petals. He cried. Not the kind of tears children shed, but the silent kind. The kind that come from something too large to hold inside. Liesl had been waiting. Not for rescue, not for escape. For someone to hear her. For someone to finally read what she had never been allowed to say. He gathered the letters into a clean envelope, sealed them, and labeled it with her name. Then he returned to Herr Bauer's house. The old man read every one, lips tight, eyes glassed. She wasn't just a pianist, he said softly. She was a messenger. Every note she played was a whisper across a battlefield. Henry nodded. What do we do now? He asked. Bauer looked at him, a strange flicker of something fierce in his gaze. We make sure the silence ends. That night, Henry returned home with a mission. He placed the envelope on his desk and began writing a new letter. Not to Liesl, not to James, but to the Austrian Historical Society, to the American Embassy, to anyone who might listen. He would not let their story fade, because the letters had finally come, and someone had finally read them. Herr Bauer found it first, buried in a reference book on early 20th century European operations. A report, brief and redacted, issued by the Imperial Austrian Military Command in January 1918. It mentioned a village in the Alps, unnamed, destroyed. Censorship had wiped most of the details, but 3 words remained legible in the margin. Operation Schneeblut, blood snow. Henry stared at the words. They had haunted the letter from the start. What happened there? He asked. Bauer took off his glasses. Something awful, something deliberate. Through weeks of research, they pieced it together. A resistance cell had formed in the winter of 1917 in a small mountain village east of Salzburg, made of local civilians, musicians, teachers, students. They had been secretly aiding Allied communications, hiding messages in sheet music and coded broadcasts. The leader was a young man, a musician, possibly a conductor. His name, Lucas Hartmann, Liesl's brother. Henry's stomach turned. One night in late January, a betrayal led to a raid. The village was surrounded. No survivors were recorded. The snow, villagers claimed later, had turned red and froze that way. It remained stained for weeks. There were whispers of an American involved. A name blacked out in every record, but it was there, in the fold of one old journal barely legible in faded ink. Captain Archer coordinated the intel, confirmed location. Execution carried out with precision. No resistance remains. Henry sat back, sick with grief. James had been right. So had Liesl. The betrayal had come from someone wearing his uniform, and her brother had died because of it. Herr Bauer looked at him across the table. Now do you understand? Henry nodded slowly. That's what she meant when she said he wore our flag, but served theirs. They knew, both of them. James had uncovered the truth, and Liesl had encoded it, layer by layer, into her letters, her music, even the phrase that seemed like poetry. When the notes fall in the 5th, the dead will speak. Henry returned home with the documents, the letters, and a weight pressing on his chest. That night he gathered everything and sat across from his father. Thomas Mallory stared at the pages in stunned silence. He read every letter, every note, every smudged signature. When he reached the report, his hands began to tremble. "My father," he began, voice rough. "He never told me." Henry waited. Thomas set the report down. "He barely spoke after the war. My mother said something broke in him. I thought it was the killing. I didn't know it was guilt." Henry didn't speak. "I remember once," Thomas said, "I found him in the attic. He was holding a piece of music, not playing, just holding it. I asked what it was. He said it was a song no one should hear twice." He looked at Henry, tears welling, "And now I know why." They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Henry whispered, "She wanted the truth to be heard." Thomas nodded. "Then we'll make sure it is." The next day they copied every letter, every page, every coded line. They sent them to historians, to archives, to a museum in Vienna that specialized in wartime music and correspondence. It took weeks, but the reply came. A curator responded in German, translated by Bauer. These letters are authentic. The music contains a level of encoded resistance not seen before. Liesl Hartmann's legacy is known in part to us. Now we understand her fully. And then, at the end, we will honor her, and the man who carried her silence for 40 years. Henry folded the letter and closed his eyes. The blood snow had spoken, and someone was finally listening. The morning after the museum's reply, Thomas stood alone in the attic. He hadn't gone up there since his father's funeral. Dust veiled every surface. The wooden beams groaned faintly under winter's weight. Light filtered through a small window, casting a pale square onto the floor. He walked to the box, and opened it slowly. The contents had barely changed. The pocket watch, the pipe, the uniform buttons. But it wasn't the items that mattered. It was what had been buried with them. Thomas sat beside the trunk, holding one of Liesl's letters. He hadn't dared read them before. Now, his hands shook as he unfolded the page. "Dearest James," they said, "the snow would fall again tonight. I hope, wherever you are, it reminds you of when we met in the garden. The way music made the air feel warmer." He closed his eyes. All his life, he had known his father as quiet, disciplined, affectionate in silence, a man of habit and few words. He remembered the small piano in the corner that had never been played, the stack of music books no one touched. Now he understood. They weren't just relics, they were remains. Henry entered the attic quietly, carrying the last of the documents Bauer had translated. He handed them to his father without a word. Thomas took them. His eyes scanned the pages, line after line. Archer's betrayal, the massacre at the village, Liesl's encoded warnings, James's silence. He read everything. Then he broke, not with shouts or fury, with stillness. He pressed his hands over his face and wept. Henry stood back, giving him space. It was not the crying of someone just learning history. It was the grief of someone recognizing truth, something that had lived inside them for years, unnamed and unacknowledged. When Thomas finally spoke, it was quiet, broken. He never said her name, not once. Henry sat beside him. He didn't forget her, Thomas nodded. He couldn't. That's why he stopped playing, why he hated winter, why he never let me learn piano. They sat there, surrounded by ghosts. After a while, Thomas opened the last letter from Liesl again, the one smudged with ink at the end. He stared at the unfinished signature, the absence of a goodbye. She died, without knowing if he lived. Henry hesitated. But maybe she hoped someone would find it, that someone would finish what she couldn't. Thomas looked at him. Then, for the first time in years, he smiled, a small, pained, flickering thing. "She was brave," he whispered, "braver than him, braver than me." That night, Thomas didn't eat dinner. He spent hours at the dining room table, writing, not with a typewriter, by hand, page after page. His handwriting was slow, precise. He wrote about James, not as a soldier, but as a man in love, haunted and silent. He wrote about Liesl, her music, her warnings, her courage. When he finished, he placed the pages in a new envelope and addressed it to the museum in Vienna. He handed it to Henry the next morning. "Send this, it's time someone else knew." Henry nodded. Before Thomas turned away, he paused. "I wish I could have asked him," he said. "Why he never told me." Henry answered quietly, "Maybe he didn't have the words." Thomas looked at his son, voice raw. Then, "Thank you for giving them back to us." Henry watched as his father walked out into the snow. It was falling again, gentle and slow, but this time it didn't feel like silence. It felt like something returning. 2 months later, a letter arrived from Vienna. It bore the official seal of the Austrian National Museum of Music and Resistance. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman named Clara Hartmann. She was Liesl's grandniece. Henry read the message aloud at the kitchen table. Thomas sat beside him, listening with a stillness that felt sacred. "I grew up hearing only fragments," the letter began, "that Liesl was gifted, that she vanished. My grandmother never spoke of her. My father mentioned once, in hushed tones, that she had been in love with an American, that she had died during the war. Nothing more. Then, now, because of you, I know who she was. what she did, and who loved her enough to carry her silence through decades of winter. Thomas's hands shook as he folded the letter. She had family, and now she had a story. Together, Henry and Thomas prepared a parcel for Clara and the museum. Inside, they placed the original letters, the fragment of music, and the faded photograph of James, one that had been hidden beneath an old atlas for years, showing him in uniform, not yet haunted. They included a note, to Liesl, whose silence was never weakness, to James, who bore it all. May the world finally listen. The reply came quickly. Clara invited them to Vienna, not just for a visit, but to speak, to bear witness. The museum was preparing a new exhibition titled Letters in Silence, Music, Memory and Resistance. Liesl's compositions would be featured, along with her story and the letters James never sent. A special section would be dedicated to Winter Without End, annotated with the decoded cipher and the phrase that had unlocked it all. He who buried the snow buried her voice. Thomas hesitated. He had never left the country, he'd never flown. But when the ticket arrived, when Henry placed it in his hands, something shifted in him. "I want to go," he said. Vienna in spring was nothing like the winters Liesl described. It was green and alive, the air warm and filled with music again. They walked the old cobbled streets where she once played. They stood outside the conservatory where she had studied. They visited the square where the resistance had first spread its whispers. At the museum, Clara met them with tears in her eyes. She looked so much like the photograph of Liesl it stunned them both. "You brought her back to us," she said. The exhibit was breathtaking. Liesl's original letters and music encased in glass. A wall-sized portrait of her beside a quote, "I have hidden what they seek. The fleur-de-lis holds the path." Visitors moved through in silence, reading, pausing, listening to the restored recordings of her work. In the center, a special space had been made, a chair, an empty one. Beside it, James's final, unsent letter, the one found in the attic, still slightly wet when opened. Thomas stood before it for a long time. Then he placed something beside it, his own letter, the one he had written weeks earlier, the one that had poured out of him like confession. Clara took his hand. "This," she said, "is healing, not only for you, for her, for everyone who was never allowed to speak." And Thomas, who had lived his whole life in the shadow of a silent man, nodded, because now he understood. Silence was not the absence of sound. It was the weight of stories waiting to be told. And at last, they had been. The museum named the room after her, the Winter Letters exhibit, Liesl Hartmann. It stood in the eastern wing, where natural light filtered gently through tall windows. The walls were painted in soft whites and greys, like snow about to fall. Visitors stepped inside with reverence, as if entering a chapel. Thomas and Henry returned for the unveiling. It was June, but inside it felt like the stillness of winter, the kind that didn't chill, but calmed. At the center stood a grand piano. Not just any piano, it was Liesl's. Recovered after the war, restored, tuned, placed where her story could finally be heard. Its black lacquer gleamed. The keys, though aged, invited touch. Beside it stood a glass case with her music, Winter Without End, displayed page by page, annotated with both musical notations and the decoded messages Henry and Bauer had uncovered. A placard explained its layered meanings. Written in exile, composed as resistance, Liesl Hartmann's Winter Without End became both a warning and a memorial. The fifth measure hides the name of her brother. The seventh echoes the date of the massacre. The melody is grief and defiance woven together. Visitors stopped there longest. But the heart of the exhibit was along the far wall. There, encased behind clear panes, rested the letters, dozens of them. James's first desperate confession, Liesl's hopeful replies, the intercepted messages, the censored final letter, still smudged, still unsigned. Each letter bore a translated transcript beneath it. Visitors leaned in. Some wiped their eyes. Others read them more than once, as if afraid the words might vanish. In the corner stood a wooden stand with a small leather-bound guestbook. By the end of the first week, it was already half full. "Thank you for giving her voice back. I didn't know resistance could be beautiful. My grandfather never spoke of Vienna. Now I understand why." Thomas read each message slowly. Then he wrote one of his own. "To the father I knew and the man I didn't, thank you for carrying her silence. Thank you for loving without erasure. Next to the guest book stood a final tribute, the uniform James had worn. Cleaned, preserved, carefully presented. A note beside it read, James Ashford, volunteer, witness, keeper of the winter letters. May his silence be remembered not as forgetting, but as love enduring beyond words. Henry moved to the last section of the exhibit. Photographs newly added. One of Liesl as a teenager, her hands over piano keys, eyes full of focus. One of James in Boston, unguarded, smiling faintly, and a new one captured only days before the exhibit opened. Thomas and Henry, standing side by side in the empty room, holding a copy of her final letter between them. The caption read, Legacy handed forward, from silence to song. A recording of Winter Without End played softly overhead, performed by a local pianist chosen specifically for her touch. Each note carried a weight that was no longer buried. As they left, snow began to fall, not outside, but within Thomas, not cold, not bitter, soft. Memory descending. He turned to Henry before stepping out into the Vienna streets. She found her way home. Henry smiled. And you helped her. They walked out together, father and son, leaving behind a story no longer lost. The auditorium was silent, not with absence, but anticipation. Dozens had gathered for the closing ceremony of the Winter Letters exhibit. Musicians, historians, students, survivors, and descendants. Among them sat Henry and Thomas, front row, hands folded in quiet reverence. At the center of the stage stood Clara Hartmann. In her hands she held a folded page. It was the letter, James's final words to Liesl, the one that had remained unread for 40 years, the one Henry had found, still wet with ink, hidden in an attic across an ocean. Now finally it would be heard. Clara unfolded the letter slowly. Her voice, when it came, was steady, strong. My dearest Liesl. She read, If this reaches you, then I have failed to keep my promise, but not my love. The world here is falling apart. Men vanish. Words are watched. But my thoughts are full of you, your hands, your music, the way you would hum just before the first note. I have seen things I cannot name. I have trusted the wrong men, spoken when I should have listened, but I carry your melody with me. It is the only thing that has not betrayed me. Clara's voice wavered for a moment, then steadied. You once asked me what I would do if the world ended. I told you I would find you. Even now, with blood on the snow and silence all around me, I am still trying. I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if I will live to see your face again, but I need you to know this. Your voice saved me. Every day. If you can, forgive me. If you can't, I understand. But wherever you are, know that you were loved. More than music, more than peace. Yours always, J.A. Silence followed, not empty, full. Then quietly, the pianist seated nearby began to play Winter Without End. This time the melody held more than notes. It held testimony. It held release. As the final chords faded, the audience rose in silence. No applause, just standing, eyes glistening, heads bowed, for love, for memory, for everything that had once been hidden. Thomas stood beside Henry, his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder. Thank you, he whispered. Henry nodded. It wasn't just us. No, Thomas said. But it had to start somewhere. Later they walked through the exhibit one last time. Clara joined them. Together they placed a small candle near the final case. Its plaque now bore new words. She waited in silence. He answered with truth. They spoke at last through us. Outside Vienna pulsed with spring, but inside the museum winter lingered, in music, in memory, in peace. And that was where it belonged. If this story moved you, subscribe for more powerful true tales. Click the next video on screen to uncover another wartime secret buried for decades.